Welcome to our next episode of Football Transfer Markets, and today we are going to cover Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. Our guest today is Mr. Daouda Doumbia, who was former FIFA football agent. Now he's a sports legal counselor. He was also a member of the legal commission of the legal organizing committee of 34th African Cup of Nations. Now he is a member of the Player Status Commission of the Ivorian Football Federation. Today's topics are as usual, so without further ado, let's begin. So, Mr. Daouda Doumbia, thanks for accepting my invitation.
You're welcome, my friend.
I know how much experience you have in the industry, not only as a former football agent, but also as a sports legal counselor. So I think you will be the perfect candidate to cover your own jurisdiction, your own country, Ivory Coast. So basically, as you may already know, what we are doing here, we basically cover three matters which differ from country to country, and we also provide the guests possibility to speak whatever he or she wants about their own jurisdiction. You know what I mean? So fourth question is absolutely up to you. You can speak about whatever you want. The only criteria that we have that it must be connected with your own domestic sports law. So that's it.
Okay.
So the three questions are domestic training compensation system. Second one is transfer fees and transfer fee types actually and conditions usually used in the domestic market, or if the clubs sell the registration rights abroad, then what kind of clauses are popular, which are common, which you about like what you generally see in practice when you work with your own jurisdiction, with your own clubs and players. And the third question is, in your country, in your jurisdiction, is there any standard employment contract form usually recommended or enforced by the league or by the football association or federation? So these are the three topics that we cover. And the fourth one I told is up to you. So let's start. Domestic training compensation system. So how it is structured in your country, how it operates.
Okay. Thank you very much, my friends, for the opportunity you give me to talk about transfer system in my country. Okay. Thank you so much. What I have to mention from the start is that it's now we are taking measures to make our football professional because we are the system is not as much professional as we should imagine because we have a lot of things to do here. You understand? So it is now that the new staff of the federation is taking measures, to get things professional, much more professional. You understand?
So just to recap, you undergoing a development process in the sense of internationalization of your domestic system. Let's emphasize, let's summarize like this. Or you do not look at the international system of training compensation. You construct it on your own. How you do it?
Okay. Locally, what we can say locally is that we don't pay training compensation here in my country. Training clubs don't benefit from training compensation when the player signs his first professional contract, because this is the principle. Training compensation has to be paid anytime the player signs his first professional contract and during the next transfers until the player
subsequent transfer.
It's not age more than 23 years old. You understand? But here in my country, clubs will sign professional contracts to young players don't pay compensation, training compensation, because the reason is that all our clubs here are from category 4. You understand?
Yes, but I'm not speaking about international.
All the clubs are category 4.
I understand, but the question is not the international categorization of the clubs. The question is about domestic ones. So if one club, domestic club, signs a player from another domestic club, isn't there a compensation between them? Or-
No, not officially, because it is not mentioned in the regulations. It's not in the regulation. There is no fee to pay as training compensation. What I
And,
know, and what is commonly used is that there is no training compensation. I told you that I'm part of the
and
legal commission of the federation. So we are writing now, we are amending the regulations
yeah.
concerning the status and the transfer of the players. So
So at the local level, you do not have on a regulatory framework, you do not have training
no,
compensation.
there are
Okay.
some deals, some kind of deals between professional clubs and
Mhm.
training clubs. Professional club will use the players from training clubs. There are some kind of deals, but officially it is not called training compensation. Most of the time, they agree about a little amount of money, and sometimes it is you don't know, I don't know how to say it, but they give them some balls, they give them some jerseys, you understand, to help them.
Yeah, like contribution in a way of equipment, you can say like
Yeah,
this. Like,
equipment, yeah. But financially,
Ma-
there is no fee that which is paid financially.
and what
Financially,
about solidarity? Yeah, what about solidarity contribution? I suppose if you do not have training compensation, you
solidarity
will also.
contribution, it is the same thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm a member of the legal commission of the federation. You
Mhm.
understand? And recently, we have been amending the regulations, and I've been charged personally to make proposals of. I don't know how to say it, but I contributed a lot in writing these new articles as amendments. And
Mhm.
I propose to federation, yeah, a local system of
Mhm.
training compensation, a local way for professional clubs to contribute to the training of the young players anytime, yeah, they sign them professional contracts. I made some
Okay,
proposals, but all
so
these proposals have been cancelled because the federation says there is nothing to pay as training compensation to a training club when they sign professional club with the young players. This
but
is
is there any
what is,
justification?
yeah, the justification. They said, for instance, yeah, because they said all our clubs are from category cap for four. Now that you are telling me that this refers to the regulation of the FIFA, I think it's a mistake we are making because FIFA says we have to imagine locally, domestically, a system that can contribute. I don't know how to say that, that contribute to the training, a domestic system of training compensation. We have to think about it and implement it. You understand?
Well,
So,
well, if you are interested in this direction, I can tell you that the categorization 4 that you have is being assigned by FIFA and only relates to the international matters. But deployment of the domestic training compensation system is absolutely up to the Football Federation of the country. So, for instance, okay, just as an example for you, in many countries there are absolutely different systems of training compensation. But for example, in United States, there is no domestic training compensation. But this is not related to the fact that they do not want to develop their young players. No, it's related to their domestic legislation of the country,
yeah.
which they have so-called antitrust, anti-cartel legislation,
Yeah.
and this law actually prevents them to establish this kind of a system because in this case they create a limited market and do not let anybody else outside the football clubs to enter into this market. So this is prohibited, and that's why they do not have a possibility to deploy domestic training compensation system. But if your domestic country doesn't have such restrictions or is, let's say, more or less liberal in this sense, you are free to define by yourself what kind of training compensation you want, in which amount you want, etc. So it's up to the federation. There is no any problem with that.
Mhm.
At least in my opinion. At least in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah,
So
but personally, I think it could be a very good thing to create to institute a local system. But since it's not to me to make the decision. You understand? Because since now the text is not definitely adopted, because we are, I can say we are at the start of the process. Yeah. So when we make the project of regulation, and then there's going to be a general assembly. You understand? Yeah, with
yeah,
all the
fully.
clubs. Yeah, they will talk about it. They will check every point. They will discuss about the project. And I think it's up to the clubs to decide if yes or not they need training compensation. But my opinion personally is that it is important to institute training compensation because you know the principle. It is the reward of the training because all the system is based on training. If training clubs have a lot of means to invest in training young players, professional players, a professional club absolutely will get top level players. So all the system is based on the training. So if you don't invest money in the training, if you don't, I don't know how to say it, assist training clubs, so somewhere there's going to be some problems because they won't be able to continue investing because they don't have the means to do it. So locally, it is important for me. This is my opinion. That's why while I was in charge of writing the project of a resolution, I put in the resolution that all the clubs, professional clubs who sign professional contract to young players, they have to pay a certain amount of money to training clubs as training compensation fees. I wrote it, I made proposals as in terms of amount of money that can be supported by professional clubs. But when we went to, I don't know how to say it, committee, we discussed about the project, and in the majority, they have decided to cancel this proposal because they say we won't be able to pay. So give
So
up your
look,
idea.
actually, yeah, I understood. Actually, there are two ways of thinking about training compensation. Okay, so there are two, let's say, contradicting opinions. The first opinion is, and I'm in line with it, is our opinion, as you just said, that it is a protection, a layer of protection, and a contribution for the investment in the domestic football. In other
Yeah,
words, by
yeah,
this system, you not only encourage investment into your country, but you also protect the investor to continue this contribution into youth football for a longer period. This is the
yeah,
first method, which I also agree. The second opinion is that training compensation actually deprives the player's movement from one club to another. I would agree with this position only in the cases where the training compensation threshold is extremely high, like the one that we have in UEFA. For example, 1 year registration of within UEFA's domain is 90,000 euros, 60,000 euros, and so on and so on. So what I try to say to you is that when you set the amount so high, you indeed deprive the player's movement. But if you set an amount, let's say, if you develop a reasonable system which both like takes into account, puts on the scales the two interests, both the investors' interests and the players' movement possibility, given to the fact the amounts are reasonable. In this case, I suppose training compensation domestically is a must.
yeah,
This is my opinion.
yeah,
So I hope and I wish you good luck in your project of the deployment of the training reward system domestically. So
yeah,
let's fix the date. Today is 4th of October 2024. I
yeah,
hope that when you make it possible and make it legally established in your country, we will come back to this episode and we'll reorganize another one saying
yeah,
that you made it. So,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah. Yeah,
okay, I
before we
understood.
move to the next topic, what I want to say concerning the training compensation is that it is useful for the actors of the system, local actors. You understand? Because training compensation has to be paid only once to a club, a training club.
Not only. I can bring you
Yeah.
Armenian example. Look how the things are done, for example, in Armenia. Just as an example. Even if the player moves as an amateur player, just as an amateur from one club to another,
Yeah.
there is also, again, training compensation payable by the same means as a professional. But when the club signs this amateur player as a professional, in order to avoid double payment to the same club, those clubs who have already received, a contribution when the player was moving while being amateur, are not entitled to receive a training compensation again. So we have like a two-layer system. One that the clubs pay when the player moves as an amateur, and then later on, if the player signs again, the same principle. Those who have been already compensated are not entitled to get the compensation, but those who didn't, they are entitled. So this is also interesting principle.
Yeah, it may be considered as an exception because regarding the regulation of the FIFA, it is just it is paid only once. Because when you get it, next time you don't get it. So I was saying that it is important for local clubs to admit the payment of training compensation because in most of the cases, when the player moves from Cote d'Ivoire to another country, European countries, for instance, in most of the cases, there is problem to pay training compensation because the European club who sign professional club to a professional contract to the club, most of the time they say this is not the first professional contract of the player because he has got the first professional contract in his country. So we are not entitled to pay training compensation to all the clubs who have trained the player in the past. We just have to pay it to the last club. You understand? So it is interesting for clubs to fight in that sense because if you lose the opportunity to be paid training compensation locally, when the player will sign another contract in Europe, for instance, the new club can refuse to pay training compensation to all the clubs because they say most of the time that it is not the first professional contract that the player is signing. He has already signed a professional contract in his country. So the club who signed a professional contract should have paid training compensation to all the club who contributed to the training of the player. So it is a necessity for clubs, training clubs, to fight to get the amount they deserve. You understand, locally, because it is not sure for them to get any kind of money when the player is going to sign in Europe. You understand? So it is important.
Yeah.
I think it is important.
I think we covered already this first question. Let's jump to the second one about transfer fees. So, how would you describe the market? How it operates? I think you also know that today was a notable day that one of the key provisions of RSTP was found contradicting to EU law. The provision that stipulates the joint and several liability for the new club in case of the termination of the contract without just cause by the player. But this is completely another topic. I do not want to jump into this because we start, this is going to be like another episode. So just within this sense, I just want to ask you about the current state of the market
locally.
Yeah, because I suppose that FIFA, this is my opinion, that FIFA has no other option than to make some amendments in this case. So we will have a little bit small shift in the principles of buyout clauses, release clauses, and regulations like that. So I want to know your opinion. How will this also impact on your market? But first things first, let's start from the transfer fees and the condition types you use domestically and when transferring the player abroad. How you regulate it?
Yeah, in practice, we have we can say two major types of transfer here. What we regularly notice is that in the contract, in the major cases, there is a release clause. A release clause when you are under contract with a club before you leave the club to move to another club. In most of the cases, there is a release clause.
Mm-hmm.
It is a certain amount of money the new club has to pay before they release you. Yeah, I know one player. The player I sent you the picture recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's playing in a top division club here, and recently he moved to Morocco. Yeah, for a test, and yeah, he succeeded the test. He was supposed to sign, and the club, the Ivorian club, claim the amount of money that was indicated in the release clause. And the club of Morocco, they say this is too much, we can't pay. So because of this amount of money, this project of transfer failed. The player has not been able to sign his contract. He has been obliged to come back to Cote d'Ivoire and play. He's now playing the league with his club. You understand? Because there was a release club. The Morocco club has not been able to pay. So because of that, the contract, the transfer has not been able to take place. This is most of the cases. Yeah, when the clubs sign contracts with players, they put in the contract a clause. Yeah, we call the name of this clause. The condition under which we are capable of releasing you to sign for a new club. This is
I know.
yeah.
This is my job to draft these clauses.
Yeah,
I know.
Yeah.
So,
so this is the first time.
But release clause, okay, we understood that release clause is commonly used in the country. But what about if there are transfers abroad? Usually, are they being structured by conditional fees, sell-on fees, or any kind of other fees? Like how you usually do it? Because back in the days, I told you, right? I told you that some of the clubs I work with had affairs with Ivory Coast. If I recall correctly, it was, if I'm not mistaken, 3-4 years ago. And if I remember correctly, all of them was with sell-on fees. And the interesting part was that we were not the one who proposed sell-on fees. It was the former club who said that if you want the player, I agree on the sell-on fee. And we said, okay, no problem. So for us, no any problem. So what is most common? Sell-on fees, transfer fees, fixed transfer fees, or conditional fees? Like what did you see in your practice? How is it going?
Yeah, in practice, we meet with three types of transfer. Transfer release clause. Transfer with submitted to release clause, and transfer with negotiation about on the transfer fee.
Fixed transfer fee.
If there is no release clause, in that condition, the two parties negotiate about the amount of money as transfer money.
Fixed amount, just fixed amount. Like
it is not fixed in previous. It's not fixed in previous, but it is they negotiate.
No, I mean by saying fixed, I mean fixed transfer fee, saying that an amount to be paid in one installment, two installments, but the amount is fixed. It's not connected. It's not connected with circumstances or whatever. For example, I'm a new club, and you tell me as a former club, you want the player? Okay, pay me 50K, something like this.
It belongs to you, yeah.
Yeah, this is fixed. This is fixed transfer fee. Yeah,
fixed transfer fee. Yeah, and the last system is, that's what I told to the guy who have not been able to sign in Morocco. I told him that his Ivorian club, they are not professional. They are not professional, or they are too much greedy, because they should, for instance, make an agreement, a deal with the club from Morocco, in the sense, okay, we agree to give you the player, okay, for this amount of money, even if it is not sufficient. But in the future, when you sell the player, we have an amount, a percentage when you sell
So
the
you
player.
offered like a combination of fixed transfer fee and sell-on fee.
Yeah.
It's reasonable, yeah. Why not?
I told him that if I were the chairman of your club here in Cote d'Ivoire, I would not oppose to the transfer. I would not oppose to the transfer because the market in Morocco and the market in Cote d'Ivoire, they are not the same. They are not the same.
Well, it's not only about the market;
So
it's about the possibility.
if you sign, that player is very good. I want you to interest yourself in it. It is a very interesting player. And I told him that if I were the chairman of your club in Ivory Coast, I would not oppose the transfer to Morocco because it is not the same showcase, is not the same visibility, it's not the same level of league. Playing there would give you more chance to go higher.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him that if I were the chairman of your club, I would accept the conditions, and I would, for instance, agree with the Morocco club on a certain percentage when it would be sold again. You understand? So to sum up, we have three types of transfer. First type based on release clause. Second type based on fixed amount of transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And third type, they agree on a certain amount, even if it is not sufficient, but the club will say the player has a percentage when the player will be sold again by the new club.
Sell-on fee.
Sell-on fee, yeah, we call it sell-on fee. Yeah, this is the way we call it. So we have.
But what about conditional fees? For example, you sell the player, but in the transfer agreement you say if the player scores 10 goals, then the former club will receive this amount. If the player, let's say, makes goal assist, this amount. If the player plays 1,000 minutes within the football season, he receives this amount. Do you have something like this or not?
Locally, no. Locally, no. Locally, no.
And internationally, did you experience some?
Yeah. Personally, I did not experience personally, but I know that we have one or two clubs, major clubs here, who are really well organized, whose contracts are really professional. We have a club whose name is ASEC. I don't know if you know ASEC. It is the biggest club in Cote d'Ivoire. The president, the chairman of this club is a lawyer like you. So he's very clever. So he has good contracts with his clubs, with the players. So I know that this club, they are very, I don't know how to say it, but they are very professional. And I know that when they sign or they do business with foreign clubs, they take all sorts of measures to safeguard their interest. Locally, no.
You reminded me about something. When I just entered into the sports industry back in the days, I was just 25 years old, and I had a very strict lawyer's mind connected with domestic legislation only. Like very, very strict, like we must only Armenian legislation and that's it. I had this mind because in my country there were not so many sports lawyers, etc. And my first general manager was very experienced in sports industry, international football industry, and he asked me about something about transfer some transfer condition, and I immediately said that no, it's not possible because Armenian legislation says this, says that, etc. And he said, no, in football everything is possible.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, it was the third day of my first employment, in the football industry. And he said, no, just read more and you will find out that international football submits to Swiss legislation, legislation of Switzerland, and Switzerland actually lets this kind of contracts to be present. I said, okay, because this is my third day and I accept that I may be wrong. Why not? So I digged it even further and later I understood what you were speaking about. So it's the same thing that you say, like football is a little bit open area to have some creativity when you draft contracts, when you negotiate. So when you say that you have this kind of club, I can imagine what kind of transactions they are structuring, etc. So it's understandable. Yeah, so I understood. Commonly speaking, you have three systems of transfers that you just described. So let's jump to the third question about standard contract form, which is being recommended or enforced by the Football Federation. How is it working? Do you have any standard contract form, employment contract, I mean?
No.
Or every club drafts their own. How is it working?
Yeah. Currently, we don't have a standard contract form. We don't have it. It's up to each club to agree on to agree with the players and make his contract. But in most of the cases, in French we say contrat d'adhésion. It is to the player. It's up to the player to adhere to the conditions that are fixed by the club in most of the cases. Because unless it is a top player, you understand, it is a top player. So things has to be done according to what he desires. If it is not the case, generally it's up to the clubs. Yeah, they have a standard form of contract for
which
each
the club,
with
the club already has.
Yeah.
So another question.
But there are some abuse in this way of doing things, because some clubs have 2 pages or 3 pages of contracts, when some other clubs have 5, even 10 pages of contracts. Understand? And in most of the cases, in the implementation of the contract, there are some troubles, because sometimes the players say, "I've not been given a copy of the contract, so I don't really know actually what is in the contract." You understand?
But your contracts must be registered in Football Federation. So Football Federation has the copy.
Yeah, 3 copies. One copy to the federation, and 2 copies to the club, and 1 has to be given to the player. But in most of the cases, players complain. They say they are not given the contract that they should get. In most of the cases, players complain. They say they don't have a copy.
That's very common for me. I have heard this thousands of times when during our practicing we ask, send me your contract, when the player applies to us. They say they do not have it, etc. But usually, as the FA has the copy of it, so usually you can obtain it through FA, or for the final instance, you can apply to FIFA saying that to use the data available in PMS if it's an international transfer. But in any case, FIFA always requests the employment contract in any case. But it's not up to that. I know this problem persists not only in your country, in many countries. This is a problem. And you know what? The problem is much deeper than it seems at first. I will tell you. For example, just imagine that I represent a player who is foreign player. For example, I do not want to say any federation. Just imagine, like, the player plays in the league where he's a foreign player. So the problem is, when, as an international lawyer, I send a request to the local football federation where the player was playing and ask upon many international legal acts, about legal protection, legal remedies, the power of attorney, everything. So I request the copy of the employment contract, provide the power of attorney that the player gave to me. This is the problem. There are federations which from time to time protect their own clubs and do not send you the copy of the contract. This is the most crucial thing that can happen, and it happens, believe me. And in that case, we just ask our colleague to participate in a case and from that country, and the player issues another power of attorney to our colleague, and our colleague already goes there physically, and in this case federation has nothing else to do than to provide a copy of the contract. So in practice we have this kind of scenario, so I can relate to this problem. But another question which is interesting, as you told that every club has its own standard contract form.
Yeah.
And you already, going back to the first question that you were covering about training compensation, that you are the one who is in charge for revising and amending the local regulations. I want to ask, do you also, at the moment, okay, now, do you have special binding and mandatory provisions in your local regulations that the club must follow when they sign a contract with the player? Or if not, did you start to include also these provisions in your project that you want to offer to federation?
Which kind of provision?
Well, let's say there are millions of provisions. For example, you can, just for the sake of comparison, it can be a provision that says special provisions of employment contract concluded with the player, and then you say the minimum length of the contract shall be 6 months and the maximum must be 5 years. Or you can say something like this. So you have do you have it in your local?
We have it. We have it.
Yeah.
We have it. And what is interesting is that we have an electronic system of registration of contracts.
Yeah, this is mandatory on international level for 2019.
We have it. We have it. And the regulations says that when you take these free copies of contract to the federation is going to keep one copy, and you club, you keep 2 copies, and 1 copy has to be given to the player. But what I was thinking right now when we're talking about this is it possible to think about a sanction in case a club does not give copy of contract to a player? Is it possible to put this kind of sanction in the regulation?
Legally speaking, if your country doesn't have strict rules on abuse of dominant position by the federation and stuff like that, it depends on your country's domestic legislation. But if you do not have strict rules on this, actually this is possible to include this kind of behavior, to define this kind of a behavior as a disciplinary misconduct and include it in the disciplinary code of your federation or of your league even. For example, what we are speaking about, I suppose we are speaking about the local RSTP, right? The local regulations on status and transfer of players. So it's possible to draft not only this, but some provisions related to violation of the local RSTP. So it's possible, but you must, in this case, you must comply with your domestic legislation, which mainly is connected with the abuse of dominant position, or let's say if you have some specificities, maybe with that specificities, because I do not want to jump into a jurisdiction where I'm not competent for. I have never worked with Cote d'Ivoire national legislation, so I'm not capable to tell you yes or not. But from the football perspective, there is no any restriction to do so. And you can. You can. No any problem.
And we are still thinking about this standard form of contract. We have been talking about it anytime we meet, and it's up to us. It's up to us to make it happen. Yeah, it's up to us. It is I don't know how to say it, but it's what from one time. Yeah, we have to stop talking about project, but to do things concretely. Clubs does not make any kind of problem to be obliged to use a standard type of contract. You understand? Because for me, to my mind, I think by doing so, we can avoid a lot of abuses in the contract.
Do you have player association in your country?
We have a player representative association here.
And do they collaborate with the federation in this sense to have a unified?
Yes, of course, yes. And I remember that they made such a proposal to the federation to use or to impose a standard form of contract to all the clubs?
Well,
I think it is
there is a
possible.
possibility.
That
Yes,
is possible.
it's possible.
Yeah, it is possible.
It's possible, and usually, if you ask me, I would do it by concluding collective bargaining agreement between the association and federation that both parties agree to stipulate this kind of clauses, etc., etc. So it's possible. I don't see any problem on that actually.
Yeah.
So also interesting, but you know what problem there is? I am actually, if you ask my personal opinion, I am very, very against of the standard contract forms. I will explain you why. Because if federation doesn't undertake any liability for the consequences of this contract, let's say the validity of the contract or the consequences of it, then why should club be obliged to comply with these terms? But why must club suffer if the federation just says, this is the standard form and you cannot deviate from it? So that's why I find that the best option is actually to just have the standard contract form as a recommendation for the clubs.
Those who want to use it.
Yes, those who want to use it, but also have special provisions which we just covering about the years of the contract, etc., the 3 copies, etc. Like you provide the clubs special provisions that the club must comply with. Okay, this is mandatory, and you also give a recommendation to use this type of contract, but you also provide the club a freedom to redraft the wording as the club wants, because excuse me, but maybe the club doesn't agree with the wording that Football Federation was using.
Yeah, of course.
And there are many cases like that, because right now when we started this project, and I speak with many great colleagues around the world, most of them are top experts, from their in the industry. So in one country they have the standard clause, in other country they don't have. But if you ask me, the best example, the best practice is to have these provisions as mandatory, but the contract per se to have it as a recommendation, because you may have a small club who doesn't have an in-house lawyer, okay? And for this club, this recommendation contract is somewhat of at least like a small layer of protection to have everything professionally at hand. But maybe there is a club which you just told me about, that the president is a sports lawyer. So I highly doubt that
this guy will not accept. He will not accept this standard contract. He will not accept it.
Yes, but I agree with him actually. I agree, because why are you coming and enforcing something on me while not sharing consequences of it with me? This is already unequal. This is not reciprocal. This is not fair. So this system to have some provisions mandatory and just a good contract as a recommendation, I think is the best option to have everything balanced and make everybody happy,
Yeah.
That's it. Okay, and the 4th question is up to you. What you like to speak about? I'm free to discuss with you anything related to football and law. What do you want?
The topic I want to talk about is related to migration of young players from Cote d'Ivoire to neighboring countries. The example is Mali. In most of the cases, the academies, training clubs, they complain about the fact that the young players move from Cote d'Ivoire to neighboring countries, and in most of the cases, they don't have the same identity. In most of the cases, they change their identity. They move from Cote d'Ivoire to Mali, and when they get to Mali, they start playing there, and there is a change, for instance, on the name of the player. It's no more the same player. So in this condition, it is going to be very difficult for clubs, training clubs of Cote d'Ivoire to ask for training compensation in case these players sign professional contract in the future. We have been seized by 1 or 2 academies about that problem, and we told them that this problem is not at the level of our commission because it should be, I don't know how to say it, it should be a problem that should be settled from federation to federation, because you can't take, I don't know how to say it, you can't say, I'm going to say the player status committee about this kind of problem and ask them to solve it, because it's not up to us to solve it. Understand? For me,
But what about
the big problem in this is, since the player has changed his identity, it becomes difficult for the training clubs in Cote d'Ivoire to be paid any kind of money in terms of training compensation, and the federation is going to lose a talent who should play for the national team, for instance. So we don't really know how to settle this kind of problem in general.
Any other topics you would like to speak about? Is there anything else you would like to cover?
Yeah, I just want to talk about the situation of the youth players in the academies.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It may have a link with the questions related to training compensation or solidarity mechanism, because it is about training youth players, young players. Yeah, what is going on in my country is that when young players are in academies, the contractual situation is not, I don't how to say it, it is not really strong with the academy. The academy does not have the possibility to get strong relationship with between the academies and the players. The principle is that at any time, the youth has the right to leave the academy anytime, because there is not any kind of contract recognized between the academies and the young players, and can permit the academies to keep the young players for something like 2 years, 3 years, or 3 years. You understand? Because the principle is that at any time the young player wants, he can leave the academy and go and register anywhere he wants. This cannot permit the academies
it's a normal, but it's a
It's
normal
not-
thing, because it's a normal thing because if you provide the player to sign a contract, employment contract, he becomes professional. So if the academy doesn't participate in professional football, they cannot offer an employment contract, which makes sense. So that's why the training compensation is created for this kind of cases, to prevent, let's say, not prevent, but to have some kind of tool to negotiate the terms of the players movement. And on the other hand, sure, you can provide, you can have countless types of contract between the academy and the player, not the player, but more or less depending on the country's jurisdiction, with the player's parents as a representative.
Yeah.
But in any case, even if you have such contracts, we again come to the same moment where this is better to be regulated by training compensation, because with that contracts, you will fall already under domestic jurisdiction and under domestic law. So you must just regulate it by us. Well, in common law countries, I'm not sure how it's being done, but I suppose it should be the same, because in continental law countries it's like this. You conclude a civil law contract between the players' parents and the youth academy. And yes, and if something happens, you apply to the national court. But if you already told me you are undergoing training compensation reforms inside the country, so I suppose better to just have this in mind and try to regulate it in a way that you could also solve the problems with youth academies.
Yeah, with youth academies, I was not talking about professional contracts, but in most of the cases, they sign training convention, training contract with the families of the players. And in practice, the length of the contract, sometimes we have 2 years of contract, you have 3 years contract, but at the federation, they consider it as an abuse. They say there should not be any kind of contract that could link the player to an academy for longer time, more than one season. You
And
understand?
on what grounds? Yes, and on what grounds, or upon which justification they say that it's an abuse if you conclude for more than one season? What is the logic behind it?
They are amateur. They are not professional. They are only amateur.
And
yeah, when you are amateur, you sign only for one season, not more than that.
that's the problem. The problem is with the regulation.
Amateur clubs cannot sign players more than one season because they are not allowed to sign professional contracts.
Yeah, but we are not speaking about the employment contract. There are countless types of contracts, like formation contract, training contract, football education contract, I don't know, scholarship contract. There are countless of ways to regulate it. So I think this is not a huge problem. It's just a matter to speak with the FA about this. It's just a matter to discuss with them to just change the regulation in a way to provide freedom for the parties to regulate it.
Because you see, it is the same problem as the Dara case. They say anytime the player wants to leave the club, he has the right to leave the club. The academies, they say they invest in the education of the players. They want to keep them for 3 years, 4 years, for them to get much more money in terms of training compensation, because they invest in the training of the players. So the objective is to keep the player under contract, even if it is a civil contract, for a certain time, more than one season, for them to give to increase the chance to get much more money when it's going to be question of training compensation payments. They say unless there won't be any protection for the clubs at any time, other academies can, like what is happening between Mali and Cote d'Ivoire, anytime they can come to your academy and pick up your player and go with him wherever they like. So they need to have a system that protect them. You understand? That protect them, that can permit them to stay with the player for a certain length of time, to train him, and then if he signs professional contract, they will benefit from 1 year or 2 year or 3 years of training compensation. For instance, this is the target. They complain anytime. They cannot make projects with players, young players, I don't know, for a certain duration. They are always taking things again. You understand? It's not possible.
Yes, that's what I was trying to ask you, because mainly, well, at least at UEFA domain, the youth development program of young players should be from 3 to 7 years. So, and this makes sense because you deploy the development program from 3 to 7 years to make the investment within the same logic and have the outcome of your own project by the anticipation to have some kind of a contribution, regardless if it's a training compensation or a full professional contract with the player or transfer of this professional. So if your limit is just one season, then the question is, when you undergo the licensing, how long is the youth development program for your country? How much the FA requires from the club to have the youth development program? Or there
No, there is not really a regulation on the topic.
Okay.
What is asked, what we ask from the academies is just to register the players, and then we ask them to create conditions for the better development in terms of sports training, in terms of school education. But there is not a business plan. They are not, I don't know how to say it, but that they are not submitted to a business plan as far, let's say, in terms of project. You start today and how many years you have to end your program. There is not a regulation on that sense. The only thing we ask from the academies, get your players registered for the federation to give them a license and to make connection with the players and the academies, and then create better conditions for their training, for the civil education, for the school education.
That's also a thing to regulate, because you must have a clear requirement for youth development program, and this program must
Yes.
correlate with the regulation of the training compensation at the same time, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you.
Once again, thank you for coming to the invitation and being guest in the podcast and covering Ivory Coast. I sincerely wish that your FA finalize the development program they are doing, and I really hope that you will have a very good training reward system. By the way, one of the meaning of this podcast, you see, is to get information from every part of the world, how the things operate internally. And why not? If we would have covered much more episodes, maybe you will find also useful information here, because here we are speaking with different professionals how the things are regulated in their countries. So there are many good examples to have in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks for everything. Thanks for everything, and
thank you too. I've been really honored to take part in this session. That gave me opportunity to talk about what is going on in my country as far as transfer system is concerned. We have the chance that is now we writing amendments in our regulations, and my talk, my experience, or my exchange with you permit me to have interesting ideas. And I can assure you that I will share these ideas with my colleagues in the writing committee of this new regulation. And I can assure you that the important ideas you shared with me are going to be taken into account to improve the quality of our regulation, to get it compliant with the requirement of FIFA. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm ready anytime you need to talk about what is going on in Africa, to talk about what we have to do to get our football developed, to get it much more professional. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward.
The pleasure was mine. Always happy to contribute in any form. Thanks for your kind words. So that's it.
Okay.
So have a nice day.
Okay. Thank you. Same to you.